Beyond Text began in 2005 when the Arts and Humanities Research Council asked academics, what do you think is the most important question that we need to investigate? And they got hundreds and hundreds of answers. And one of the key themes that emerged was, well, how do people communicate? How do they communicate when they're not writing it down? How do you communicate across time? How do you communicate between generations? What should we be preserving for the future? And that turned into a £5.5 million programme which started in 2007.
So, huge questions that you have been addressing for the last 2.5 years. It's not without text, though. Beyond Text is different, isn't it?
So Beyond Text absolutely doesn't mean without text. Beyond Text means this podcast, for example, will have started as a bunch of notes, and then it's a series of voices, and then somebody might take more notes following this. So my voice, as it were, will come off a page, through my throat, out into the internet, and then pass into somebody else's notes there.
You say off the page, but you're not reading at the moment. We're not reading.
No, that's absolutely true. We're not reading. But I suppose it's my head is full of the things that I have already read there. So Beyond Text is trying to kind of move beyond this simple dichotomy of there's the written and there's all the other stuff there. There's the visual, the oral, the aural, and getting beyond that notion of if it's written down, it's one kind of thing. If it's spoken, it's another sort of thing. And what does it mean if we want to preserve the things that are not written down? I mean, sometimes that's very easy. Pots survive for millennia, and they can then go into museums. But
this
songs,
is everyday household pots?
Everyday household pots,
yeah.
Lots and lots of stuff. There's intangible heritage as well, and that's much more evanescent. That disappears much more easily, or so we think. And yet if you imagine songs, folk heritage, stories that are told over generations, they too survive and communicate over time, over generations, between families. So we have these kind of tangible things which we can put in museums, and then we have these intangible things like songs, games, sung poetry, and where do we store that?
Listening to you talking about all these interesting ideas and projects, you're clearly having to cross loads of disciplines to do this.
Beyond Text is a hugely interdisciplinary project, and that's what's exciting about it. Of the many interesting projects we've got going is a project that Andrew Roberts is doing in Dundee on poetry, on looking at poetry, how people actually respond to the visual effects of poetry on paper. Involves English literature specialists, artists, and psychologists who are working together to think about how do you respond not to the words, but to actually the way the words are spread out on the page.
£5.5 million grant is a significant amount of money. How have you decided to distribute the research project?
So the research money is divided into different categories. We have research workshops, which are intense bursts of activity over a year to answer really significant problems. So one workshop is Sally Harper's study of how medieval bardic song was performed in both Scotland and Wales. And simple question, really difficult to answer. Were these sung poets, were they just standing there with a stick, or did they have a Celtic harp? What was the musical accompaniment? So then the other grants are networks, which bring people together for up to 2 years to think about a project over a lengthier period of time, where the outcome is not so much an exhibition or a piece of poetry, but actually the connections that people are making amongst each other. Then we have large and small grants, and large grants can be up to £400,000, and those are a big multidisciplinary, big team investigations, for questions that can only be answered by a lot of people coming together and working very, very hard over 3 years. Small grants do exactly what it says on the tin. They take a much smaller amount of money, about £150,000, and they investigate over 18 months a much more narrowly focused question.
Could you give me an example of one of the larger grants?
Yeah. We have 7 large grants, all of which are underway at the moment. And one of the large grants is Andrew Burns Playground Games. He's based at the Institute of Education, and they're going into 2 playgrounds, one in London and one in Sheffield, and exploring how children actually play today. Not what they say they do, but what they actually do. And this is being compared to records that were kept in the British Sound Archive, the British Library, by a very important group of specialists called the Oppies. So we're digitising that earlier material, comparing it to contemporary material, and trying to think how children and the way they play and the way they teach each other to play has changed over time. And one of the conclusions is, in fact, that it hasn't changed that much.
In an age at the moment where there are huge cuts that the new government has imposed on the public sector, £5.5 million is a very, very large sum of money. How would you justify that to the man in the street or somebody on welfare who is struggling at the moment?
People often ask, how dare you spend £5.5 million on something like Beyond Text when there are cuts ahead? And the simple answer is that we need culture as much as we need all the basic welfare payments, that understanding our humanity means understanding our past, understanding our present, and thinking about what we want to leave behind for future generations. And what Beyond Text does is help answer some of the most fundamental questions that we need to know about our culture. It will also have a big impact on some of the economic problems that we have in terms of our cultural industries, in terms of supporting our heritage industries, in terms of our museum sectors, some of the things that Britain's actually really good at.
It's a very difficult question to have to answer, but you are absolutely convinced that it will make a difference.
The many projects that we have underway will make a difference to the cultural industries, for example. We have a project that's being run by Alice O'Grady on festivals. Music festivals are one of the big growth areas, big earner for local areas. You think of Glastonbury, it brings in thousands and thousands, millions of pounds for the local communities as well as for Britain as a whole. So what Alice is studying are those ephemeral theatrical moments, the bits where people come out of a tent and suddenly there's a stilt walker there, or there's a big new fad for putting clothes pegs on your clothes and walking around in a group. And Alice is studying why this happens and how people respond to it. And not only is she understanding the ephemera of those moments of performance, the way audiences interact with performers, she's feeding back that information to festival promoters so they can improve the activities that they promote.
Let's time travel 20 years on, 20, 30 years on, and you'll be looking back over this project. How would you like to view it in 20 or 30 years? I
think in 20 or 30 years' time, what we will find is that Beyond Text was quite revolutionary in its ambitions and the way it tried to bring people together from such a wide span of different disciplines to answer a very simple set of questions. If we've answered those questions, or even come halfway to answering those questions, what we will have saved for 2030 or 2040 will be quite different from what we imagined we might want to preserve today. So I think we will have a much greater respect for the things that sort of slip between our fingers without our even knowing it. The sounds, the smells, the tastes. It's very easy to imagine just letting those go, not preserving them, but particularly working both in the past and in the present, and with the digital technologies available to us, we've recognised how fragile our ability to store and preserve the present really is.